So let me ask you, have you ever been stuck in traffic? Maybe you were on the interstate or on a highway and there was a barrier in front of you. Maybe it was a wreck or maybe it was a construction. Sometimes you get stuck in traffic. The world's longest traffic jam, according to the internet, was in 2010 in China. The traffic jam was 100 kilometers long and lasted 12 days. People were stuck in their cars for 5 to 6 days in this traffic jam. It was a long traffic jam due to a barrier that was in front of them. Today, we're going to talk about barriers. We've been talking about Jesus making his way to Jerusalem. A few weeks ago, we talked about him walking with his disciples and having some conversations with them. This will be Jesus' last trip into the city as he prepares for his coming death. And today, he's going to spend some time in some different ways teaching us about barriers to prayer, barriers to worship. So let's dive in today. Let's look at Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 17. They came to Jerusalem, and he went to the temple and began to throw out those buying and selling. He overturned the tables and the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and would not permit anyone to carry goods through the temple. He was teaching them, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of thieves." Mark tells us they came to Jerusalem. Well, that's because they were probably staying out in Bethany. They were staying the night in Bethany and coming into the city during the day. And they came to the temple. And the temple was a magnificent place. It's a place with a lot of history. And, we talk about the temple. Well, in Israel's history, there's been several manifestations of the temple. Solomon's temple was the first structure that was built in which the Jews could worship the Lord. It was constructed about 957, but it was later destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Now, they went into captivity, but the Persian king Cyrus allowed them to go back, and when he sent back the Jews, he mandated they build a new temple. And that temple is called the Second Temple, or Zerubbabel's Temple, and it was completed in about 515 BC. Now, many years later, in 63 BC, the Romans captured Jerusalem and the temple. And Herod the Great came to power a few years later in 37, and he began to enlarge Zerubbabel's temple in 20 BC. And those renovations weren't completed until 64 AD, just 6 years before the temple was destroyed again. So the Jews, we talk about the temple. Well, they've had 2 temples, and one of them has kind of had two manifestations to it. But when Jesus comes to the temple that day, it's a magnificent place. It is huge. It's 35 acres big. Jesus comes into the temple, and there's different portions of the temple. One area is called the Court of the Gentiles. This was an area of the temple where those people who were converting to Judaism, they weren't born as Jews, they weren't born as part of the nation of Israel, but they see something in their religion, and they convert to Judaism. Well, these Gentiles can come into this place, and they can worship the Lord here in the temple, a place special for them. I want us to take a moment, though, and I want us to consider the physical places in which we worship, the physical places in which we pray. Why is it important for believers to have a physical space dedicated to prayer and or worship? First Corinthians 3:16 tells us that we are the temple of God. Because a believer is indwelled by the Spirit, we become the temple of God because that's where God's presence resides. But even though we don't need a temple to go meet with the Lord, humans have always sought out sacred spaces. You think about it. In ancient history, the pagans always sought out sacred spaces. The Israelites wanted a space to go worship the Lord. We always seek out sacred spaces that we can go to. But even in times where sacred spaces aren't set aside officially, humans seek out a place to pray. They seek out a place to worship. Think about Daniel. He stood at his open window looking toward Jerusalem. He couldn't go to a temple and worship the Lord, but he set aside a space. Paul, when he's traveling around, he finds Lydia and those other God-fearing women worshiping out by the river outside the city gates. They sought out a special place to go and worship the Lord. So no, it's not necessary for us to go to a place to worship, but humans seek out places that are special to worship. In our modern day, it might be a place that is devoid of a TV, devoid of an iPhone or a tablet, a place that we can set aside to spend time with the Lord. If it's in your home, it's going to be a place maybe where you can't see the dirty dishes. You can't see all the stuff you need to be doing. See, we seek out sacred spaces to worship. And if you think about church, coming into the church building, the church house with other worshipers, There's something special about that. Oh yeah, I can watch TV and I can watch a sermon online. I can watch a worship service online. I can even sing on my couch. We did that in 2020. But there's something special about coming in to the midst of other worshipers and worshiping the Lord. So Mark tells us that he went into Jerusalem and into the temple. And after looking around at everything, since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So that's in Mark 11:11, the night before the events that we're going to talk about. Jesus went into the temple and he observed what was going on. He looked around at things and I think he got concerned. And he went home that night and he began to develop a plan. And he went in the next day to the city, and we see that Mark tells us that he began to drive out the money changers, drive out those who were selling animals. And John tells us he fashioned a whip to do that. So Jesus goes in and he drives out these people. Why? Well, he's driving out the people who are in the court of the Gentiles. They're preventing other people from worshiping him. And so I think Jesus doesn't just have a zeal for the house of God, the place, but he has a passion for what's supposed to be taking place in that place. And he sees a few barriers to the Gentiles' ability to worship the Lord. I think those barriers include worldly activity, a worldly mindset, and worldly indifference. Now, those selling animals for sacrifice, they had turned the sanctuary into a sale barn. They were doing a duty that needed to be done. People needed to buy these animals for sacrifice. They traveled away and they couldn't always bring them with them. Some commentaries say that in the past, a place for this activity had been set up on the Mount of Olives. Others have remarked that it took place in Solomon's colonnade. It did not normally take place in the court of the Gentiles. This is not the place for that. This is an activity that has been moved into this place to do things that need to be done, but it's in the wrong place, and it's become a barrier to those who need to pray and want to pray to the Lord. So these worldly activities are taking place in the temple. But also, what about the worldly mindsets? Mark tells us there were money changers in the temple. Money changers doing a deed that needed to be done, because people would come to the temple and they would have their Roman coinage or their Greek coinage, and they would need to convert that over to Jewish coinage, because that's all that was accepted in the temple when people paid their required temple tax. So these money changers were doing a duty that needed to be done, but they were doing it in the wrong place, and they were doing it in a lot of ways with the wrong motives, because they were charging exorbitant exchange rates, fees for changing over this money. The people had to do it, and it needed to be done, but they were charging worldly amounts to make it possible. So they had a worldly mindset. But there's also worldly indifference. Mark talks about those carrying goods through the temple. Well, this is kind of an interesting thought process. The temple, I said, was huge, and it took up a good portion of the city. And if you want to get from one side of the city or to the other side of the city, you could go around the temple, but that might take you a little while, especially if you're carrying something that's heavy. But so people were cutting through the temple, cutting through the court of the Gentiles. In the place where people were supposed to be praying and spending time with the Lord, there were people carrying merchandise through the courtyard. They had an indifferent view of what was taking place in this sacred area. So Jesus drove them out as well. You can't carry that through here. Go around the temple, he said. So Jesus is trying to confront these barriers, worldly activity, a worldly mindset, and worldly indifference, these barriers to prayer. So I want us to stop and I want us to consider for ourselves. When we go into a time of prayer or we come into the church to worship, in what ways can we face the same barriers in those situations? When we sit down to pray or we come into church to worship, our mind can be on a lot of things. It can be on the activities of the world. We can have the wrong mindset sometimes when interacting with folks in worship. And sometimes we can be indifferent when we sit down to pray or to read our Bible or even to come in to worship. You see, these barriers existed. They existed for these folks physically in the temple, and they exist for us today in our minds and in the world around us. So Jesus drove out those who were putting up these barriers to prayer and worship. And I think Jesus can show us something. We can learn something from this event. We can learn that believers should seek to remove all distractions from prayer, both for themselves and for others. And Jesus' actions don't go unnoticed. You don't drive out a bunch of people from the temple and it go unnoticed. But I want us to look now. Let's see how the religious leaders responded to Jesus and how the other people who saw this and learned from Jesus, how they responded as well. Look at Mark chapter 11, verses 18 through 19. The chief priests and the scribes heard it and started looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him because the whole crowd was astonished by his teachings. Whenever evening came, they would go out of the city. Now, these activities taking place in the temple, the selling of goods, the changing of money for exorbitant fees, the indifference of those walking through the temple. All those activities, they took place in full view and with the full support of the leadership of the temple and of the larger religion. The religious leaders supported what was going on in the temple that day. And when Jesus drove these people out, he was in effect calling their authority into question. And they didn't ignore it. They saw what was happening. They understood what Jesus was doing and what Jesus was saying by his actions. And what they want to do to him, they said, we're going to kill him. That's quite a big response to this, but they want to kill him. I think it's because they're jealous of Jesus. They're jealous of Jesus' authority. They're jealous of Jesus' power grab, as they might see it. They've got bad feelings toward him. Their emotions and their logic is taking over. Sometimes in our lives, the things going on in our brains and in our emotions and in our hearts, they can become barriers to prayer and barriers to worship as well. I want us to stop again, do a little introspection, and I want you to consider how our unhealthy feelings like jealousy, anger, pride, or bitterness can get in the way of worshiping the Lord and praying to him. Now, in verse 25, Jesus is going to talk about forgiveness as it relates to prayer. And while that verse is specifically about forgiving others, I think the rule holds. God cares about what's going on in our hearts when we come to him. When we're angry with someone and we come to worship or we go to pray, that can be a barrier to us connecting with a God who loves us and really could be angry at us if he desired to be. You know, when we are jealous of someone, we can go into God's presence and forget his justice and forget his grace and forget his mercy in our lives. You know, when we experience these things, these emotions in our life, they can become barriers to what God wants for us and become barriers to us connecting with him through prayer. These people, these Jewish leaders, their emotions were getting in the way. What they wanted was getting in the way with their ability to see who Jesus is. If they just had eyes to see and ears to hear, they would realize that the person driving out these money changers and these people selling the animals, he was more than just a man. He was a Messiah. But their emotions and what they were feeling got in the way. Same thing happened to us. We have to check our emotions. We have to look into our lives and say, what's going on in me before I come to prayer, before I come to worship. And I think we can be reminded of a truth here. We can be reminded that believers must diligently make sure that their prayers are not hindered by jealousy or any other negative feelings. So after Jesus cleanses the temple, he just doesn't run for the hills. He doesn't go seek cover. He stays in the temple and he begins to teach people. He begins to teach them about what he's done and who he is and what this temple is all about and about the kingdom, because he's always talking about the kingdom. And so Jesus spends time with them, and while the religious leaders responded negatively with full of jealousy, the people who heard Jesus, they were astonished. They were ready to hear what he had to say. So he spent the day teaching them, and that night he went home again. He went back to Bethany again to spend the evening. And the passage picks up the next day on their way back into Jerusalem again. So let's look at that. Let's look at Mark chapter 11, verses 20 through 25. Early in the morning, as they were passing by, they saw the fig tree withered from its roots up. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Jesus replied to them, have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown in the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, everything you pray and ask for, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, so that the Father in heaven will also forgive you your wrongdoings. Now, the day before, as Jesus is going into the city to cleanse the temple, they're on their walk, and they pass a fig tree. And Jesus, he's hungry, because he's human, and he wants some food. So he goes over to the fig tree, and there's no figs on the tree. So Jesus curses the fig tree. Now, this is an interesting account, and I think we need to notice what Mark's doing here. Mark is coupling the cursing the fig tree and the temple cleansing together. He puts those two stories together for us in this little passage, and he's showing us something. He's showing us that the fig tree, like Israel, is barren. The fig tree didn't have any fruit, and Israel is not bearing any spiritual fruit. They're spiritually barren, and that is put on display in the temple. So we can see all this together, and Mark's trying to teach us something about the temple, but I want us to focus on what our lesson's about today. It's about barriers to prayer, barriers to worship. So let's focus in on how Peter responds to the fig tree when he sees it the next day. Jesus curses it one day, and they come back by the next day, and it's withered to the roots. And how does Peter respond? He is shocked. He is amazed, maybe at the speed at which it happened, maybe at the fact that it had withered all the way to the roots in one day. He is shocked and amazed. Are you ever shocked and amazed when Jesus or the Lord answers your prayers? When you pray to God and you ask Him for something, and then it happens, you're like, that wasn't prayer. That's just circumstances. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we question God's answer to prayer. When someone prays for something else, someone prays for someone's healing, someone prays about a situation in their family, and then they tell us about it, and we're like, oh, that's great. But really we're thinking, no, I know what happened there. The doctor picked the right medicine. Oh, I know what happened there. This family member, they decided to just, to eat crow or whatever, and it's fine. See, we sometimes we deny prayer. Why? Why do we do that? Why do believers sometimes express shock when the Lord answers their prayer and the prayers of someone else? Sometimes we practice what's called practical atheism. You say, I'm not an atheist, I'm a believer. Well, we practice practical atheism. And what does that mean? That means sometimes we act like unbelievers. We act like people who don't believe in God. Even though we do believe, we act like we don't believe. Now, one way we do that is just simply through sin. We say we follow Jesus and we don't live like that. That's one way we do that. Another way we do that is related to prayer. We don't expect Jesus to answer our prayers. We don't expect God to completely be involved in our life and to answer and to address those situations that we take to Him. We act like practical atheists. We act like atheists when we are shocked that God actually listens to us and that God actually answers our prayer. And that's kind of what Peter's doing here. Peter's like, whoa, that tree, it responded to the curse. What Jesus said was going to happen really happened. I can't believe it. So what does Jesus say to him? How does Jesus respond? Jesus says, have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, everything you pray and ask for, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, so that the Father in heaven will also forgive you your wrongdoing. I think in this passage we can see three components to prayer. Three components to asking the Lord, to taking our petitions to the Lord, and they are believing, asking, and right relationships. Now in verse 23, Jesus used a little bit of hyperbole. This is a teaching method that he's used before and that sometimes a teacher might use. And imagine them standing on the Mount of Olives, because they were kind of walking in Jerusalem there. And from the Mount of Olives on a clear day, you can see the Dead Sea. And so he says, y'all, just think on this for a second. If you ask God to take this mountain and throw it into the sea over there, and you believe, it'll happen. He's using a little bit of hyperbole, and he's showing them that God can do anything when we believe. Now, note here, Jesus isn't saying if you believe hard enough, if you believe strong enough. He says if you believe. The issue isn't the potency of our belief. It's the person in whom we believe. Jesus says, believe that God can do anything when you ask Him. So the first component to prayer and asking God about things is belief that God can take care of stuff. The second component is simply asking. Jesus knows what we need. The Lord is aware of the situations in our life that we want to bring to Him, that we need to bring to Him. He knows all that. But the Lord wants us to ask. We believe He can do it, so let's ask Him to do it. That's what God says. His second component is simply asking Him, taking our situations to Him. Third component is right relationships. Jesus makes it clear that our horizontal relationships with other people needs to be good, needs to be right before we exert our vertical privilege with the Lord. See, it's a privilege to pray, but if we don't have our relationships right, this privilege is broken. And there might be a lot of reasons that we can talk about why right relationships are important when we pray, but I want to focus on one aspect of this. If you are in a broken relationship with someone in your life, either by something you did, something they did that you're not forgiving them for, whatever the reason, if we're living in broken relationships, we're living in sin. That's just a fact. If we can't forgive them, if we can't work out the situation, we are living in sin. And when we're living in sin, we're not being led by the Spirit. And we're not being led by the Spirit, we won't know how to pray. Jesus says believe and ask, and the Spirit guides us on how to ask, what to ask for. And if we are having broken relationships with those around us, and we can't be led by the Spirit because of that sin, the Spirit can't guide us in prayer. So the three components are to believe, ask, and have right relationships. All of these work in tandem. We got to have all of them together for our prayers to be successful in our life, for our prayer life to be meaningful. All of these work in tandem. We need to have all of these for our prayer life to be meaningful. If we don't, they become barriers to our ability to pray. And I think we can see how this works if you go to 1 John chapter 5, verse 14 and 15. This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. And if we know that He hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we asked of Him. We believe in a powerful God, we ask a powerful God, and we pray in the will of that God when we are led by the Spirit. Peter sees this tree. He is amazed that what Jesus said would happen, happened. I think we can be reminded through this conversation that Jesus has that believers should pray with faith out of a forgiving heart. In today's lesson, we've looked at three kinds of barriers to prayer. You might not have picked up on them, but we looked at three kinds of barriers. We looked at outward barriers, inward barriers, and spiritual barriers. Outward barriers like a worldly activity and worldly mindset and worldly indifference. Inward barriers like unhealthy emotions such as anger and jealousy and pride and bitterness. And spiritual barriers including faithlessness, refusal to take our problems to God, and sinfulness including broken relationships. You know, when we study the cleansing of the temple, we don't often think that that's going to be a lesson on prayer. But I think what we see is Jesus wasn't just concerned with the temple. He was concerned with the activity of those in the temple. They were being barred from prayer. There are things in our life that become barriers to prayer. Maybe it's one of these that I named today, where I think anything is going to fit inside those categories, outward, inward, or spiritual barriers. So I want you to spend some time this week doing a little introspection, looking at yourself, looking at your heart, looking at your activities. And I want you to discover the biggest hindrances to your prayer life. And I want you to consider how you can remove those obstacles that keep you from praying more effectively. Challenge you this week. Find those barriers and remove them from your life. I'll see you next week.